In today's episode, we'll be sharing some disturbing horror stories about cults. So before we begin, consider giving us a like. It helps a lot. Also, feel free to share your true stories. I might add it to a future video. I've always used Grindr for more than just dating. It's a way to meet new people, make friends, and occasionally see where things go. When I matched with Brian, he seemed friendly enough, polite, a little quirky, and genuinely interested in meeting. After exchanging a few messages, we decided to go on a date. The plan was simple. I'd pick him up, and we'd grab coffee or a quick bite. He lived in a part of town I wasn't too familiar with, but that didn't bother me much. I was used to meeting people from all kinds of places, and I figured this would be no different. As I was driving to his address, my phone buzzed. It was Brian. "Hey," he said, his voice chipper but a little hurried. "Do you mind if we change plans? It's kind of a hassle to go out tonight. Why don't you just come to my place instead?" Something about the request didn't sit right with me. It wasn't that I hadn't met people at their homes before. It was more the way he asked, as if he was steering the situation into his comfort zone. But I brushed off the unease. He seemed nice enough in our chats, and it was probably just my overthinking. "Sure," I said after a pause. "I'll head over." When I pulled up to Brian's place, the first thing I noticed was how dimly lit the street was. His building wasn't run down exactly, but it had an air of neglect, peeling paint, a flickering porch light, and a faint smell of dampness in the air. I parked and texted him, and a moment later, he appeared at the door, waving me inside. Brian looked like his pictures, which was a relief, but there was something slightly off about him in person. I told myself to relax. It was probably just first date nerves. His room, however, was another story. The walls were covered with strange decorations, altars filled with candles, jars of what looked like animal bones, and framed artwork that seemed more like sketches from a nightmare than anything decorative. My stomach tightened as I took it all in, the unease I'd felt earlier rushing back in full force. "What do you think?" he asked, watching me closely. "It's unique," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. He laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I like collecting things. Keeps me grounded, you know?" I nodded, not knowing what to say. When I asked about one of the altars, his expression darkened. "Don't touch that," he snapped, his voice sharp. I froze, startled by the sudden change in his tone. Then, just as quickly, he softened. "Sorry," he said, smiling again. "It's just really personal to me." The mood swings left me on edge. I suggested that his roommate join us, hoping to diffuse the awkwardness. Brian's face immediately fell. "No," he said firmly. "This is about us. I want to get to know you, not them." Something inside me screamed to leave, but I stayed for now. As we sat on his bed, the unsettling vibe of the room seemed to thicken around me. Brian's erratic behavior only added to my discomfort. One moment, he'd be kind and almost endearing, brushing his hand lightly against mine and smiling like we'd known each other forever. The next, his face would twist in irritation, his words curt and tinged with frustration, as though I'd said or done something to upset him. When he placed his hand on my thigh, I shifted uncomfortably, trying to steer the conversation to neutral ground. He didn't seem to notice or care. His touch grew bolder, his hand sliding higher, and I gently but firmly moved it away, laughing awkwardly to ease the tension. "You're playing hard to get," he said, his tone somewhere between playful and accusatory. "Not at all," I replied, keeping my voice calm. "I'd just like to take things slow." He didn't respond, instead staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Trying to break the tension, I playfully reached out and patted the small of his back. It was a mistake. Brian's reaction was immediate and explosive. He jerked away violently, his hand clenching into a fist as though he were about to swing at me. My heart stopped as I raised my hands defensively, the air between us thick with unspoken danger. For a moment, I thought he might hit me. But then he exhaled sharply, his fist relaxing as he forced a smile back onto his face. "Sorry," he muttered, his voice flat. "I just don't like being touched there." Before I could respond, he leaned in and kissed me, pressing harder than I was comfortable with. My body stiffened, and I gently pushed him back. "I think I should go," I said quietly. Brian's expression darkened immediately. "Why? Did I do something wrong?" His voice teetered between pleading and demanding, his mood swinging wildly again. No, no, I said quickly, trying to keep the situation calm. It's just getting late, and I have an early morning tomorrow. He stood up, blocking my path to the door. You don't have to go, he insisted. His tone was desperate, almost angry. We were just starting to have fun. My chest tightened as I weighed my options. He hadn't done anything explicitly violent yet, but his demeanor and the growing tension made me feel trapped. I decided to stay firm but non-confrontational. I really do need to go, I said, keeping my voice steady. Thank you for inviting me over. He stared at me for a long moment, his jaw tightening before he stepped aside. Fine, he said coldly, his earlier friendliness gone. I grabbed my coat and moved quickly to the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. As I stepped into the hallway, I felt his eyes boring into my back. I didn't dare look behind me until I was safely outside. The cold night air was a relief as I reached my car and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, the weight of the encounter sinking in. I replayed every moment in my mind, the red flags I'd ignored, the uneasy feeling I'd dismissed. As soon as I got home, I blocked Brian on Grindr. I also adjusted my privacy settings, ensuring my location was hidden and my profile limited to only those I explicitly approved. The experience left me rattled, but more than that, it left me questioning my judgment. Why had I ignored my gut? Why had I stayed when every part of me was screaming to leave? I've learned to trust my instincts more since that night. No matter how innocent or friendly someone might seem online, nothing is worth risking your safety over. The plan was simple, a weekend escape with my closest friends, my partner, and my youngest brother to see Orville Peck in Kansas City. We wanted to make it special, so instead of booking separate hotel rooms, we rented an Airbnb in Grandview, a quiet suburb just outside the city. It was cheaper, convenient, and gave us a shared space to relax before and after the concert. The house was charming in photos, mid-century vibes with eclectic decor, but in person, it was different. The first thing we noticed were the religious symbols scattered throughout the house. Crosses hung on nearly every wall, mixed with other symbols we couldn't quite place. Some had a strange, almost occultist feel to them, angular shapes and cryptic patterns that didn't align with typical religious imagery. For a visibly queer group like ours, it felt a little uncomfortable, but we laughed it off. Just Midwestern eccentricity, someone joked, and we all agreed to not let it dampen the weekend. Still, there was something off about the atmosphere of the place. It wasn't just the symbols, it was the silence, the stillness. Even the air felt heavy, like the house itself was watching us. The first night, after settling in, my youngest brother wandered into the guest suite. He was always the curious one, and it didn't surprise me when he started poking through the books on the shelves, commenting on their odd titles and dusty condition. That's when he found it. Guys," he called out, holding up a small plastic packet. We crowded around him, and my stomach dropped when I saw it. Inside the packet was a residue of white powder, unmistakable in its implications. "Is that?" one of us asked, though we all already knew the answer. It was heroin. The realization hit hard, the weight of it pulling the mood of the room down instantly. Why was this here? Who had left it, and why had no one removed it? "What do we do?" my brother asked, his voice quiet. After a hurried conversation, we decided not to report it. We didn't want to risk an argument with the host or involve the police when we were only staying for one more night. But none of us felt right about it. The discovery set the tone for the rest of the stay. Every creak of the house, every shadow on the wall, felt sharper and more menacing. None of us said it aloud, but we were all thinking the same thing. This place wasn't safe. The next day, while the rest of us attended the concert, my partner decided to stay behind at the Airbnb. They'd been feeling a little under the weather and figured some quiet time would help. When we returned, their expression told me immediately that something was wrong. "You won't believe what I found," they said, their voice low. They led me to a small, locked cabinet in the living room that had been left slightly ajar. Inside were books and materials that went far beyond the strange religious symbols we'd already seen. These weren't ordinary items. They were steeped in the occult. Titles referencing rituals, symbols that looked ominous, and notes scribbled in margins gave the impression that whoever owned this house wasn't just religious, they were practicing something darker. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I flipped through one of the books, its pages filled with handwritten notes in red ink. This was no quirky Midwest home. As if that wasn't enough, one of us decided to check the Airbnb reviews. What we found confirmed our growing fear. Several guests had mentioned the male host brandishing a gun in response to criticism, his behavior defensive and intimidating. Some described him as erratic, while others warned future guests to stay away for their own safety. We looked at each other, the same thought passing unspoken between us. We had to leave. Packing up felt surreal. Every sound in the house seemed amplified. The creak of floorboards, the rustling of bags. My partner kept glancing toward the windows as if expecting someone to appear. As we carried our things out to the car, the unease grew heavier. My partner suddenly stopped mid-step, their face pale. "Do you see that?" they whispered, pointing toward the edge of the property. I followed their gaze and froze. Two figures, dressed entirely in black, stood near the back of the house, partially hidden by the shadows. They weren't moving, just watching. The moment they realized they'd been seen, they bolted, disappearing behind the house. "Get in the car," I said sharply, my voice steady despite the fear tightening in my chest. We didn't waste a second. The rest of the bags were tossed into the trunk without care, and we piled into the car. My hands trembled as I started the engine, and I didn't let myself exhale until we were several blocks away. Once we were far enough from the house, the tension in the car began to ease, replaced by a heavy silence. No one knew what to say. We ended up booking a hotel for the night, splitting the cost between us. It wasn't what we'd planned, but at least we felt safe. Later, as we debriefed the situation, we speculated about the figures in black. Were they drug users, drawn to the heroin stash my brother had found? Were they part of something darker, connected to the occult materials in the house? Or were they simply people up to no good, prowling the property for other reasons? We'd never know. The day started out perfectly. The weather was cool but sunny, the kind of day that begged for an outdoor adventure. My family and a couple of close friends, including their young child and our newborn, decided to take a walk on a trail near my friend's dad's house. It was a familiar path, one we'd been on many times before, and we thought it would be the perfect way to enjoy the afternoon together. The trail wove through a forested area, the trees arching overhead to create a serene canopy of golden light. The kids were happy, chattering and giggling as we walked, while the adults caught up and enjoyed the calm of the surroundings. It was one of those moments that felt almost too perfect to be real, and I couldn't help but smile at how peaceful everything seemed. That peace was broken when we noticed them. A group of people, about 20 in total, appeared ahead of us on the trail. They were walking in our direction, dressed mostly in white. Their presence was odd, not alarming exactly, but enough to make me take notice. They moved as one, their expressions unreadable, their pace steady and purposeful. As they passed us, we exchanged polite nods, though the silence felt heavy, as if something unspoken hung in the air. We continued walking, brushing it off as a strange but harmless encounter. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. We hadn't gone far when I glanced over my shoulder and froze. The group, which had walked past us earlier, had turned around. Now they were following us. At first I told myself it was a coincidence. Maybe they'd forgotten something or decided to take a different route. But their behavior didn't match that explanation. Their movement seemed more deliberate now, their pace steady as they closed the gap between us. I nudged my partner, and their expression mirrored my unease. We exchanged quiet glances with the others in our group, trying not to alarm the kids. The chattering and laughter from earlier had faded, replaced by a tense silence as we quickened our pace slightly, hoping to put some distance between us and the group. The strangest part was their energy. It wasn't just that they were following us. It was the way they seemed to grow more excited as they did. From the corner of my eye, I noticed subtle gestures and quiet murmurs among them, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. We needed to make a decision. Fast. The tension was unbearable. Every step forward felt like a gamble, the group's steady pursuit gnawing at my instincts. My partner leaned in close, whispering, "We need to get off this trail." I nodded, scanning the area for an escape. That's when I remembered a side path further up ahead, a narrow, lesser-used route that veered into thicker woods. It wasn't ideal, but it was the only option. "Follow me," I whispered to the group, trying to keep my voice steady for the kids' sake. When we reached the fork, we quickly turned down the hidden path, ducking into the dense trees. The thick foliage swallowed us, the air cooler and darker under the canopy. We moved quietly, careful not to disturb the leaves or snap any branches. "Over here," I gestured, leading everyone to a spot where the trees grew tightly together, creating a natural hiding place. We crouched low, shielding the young ones and keeping the newborn bundled tightly to avoid any noise. For a moment, everything was silent except for the faint rustle of the wind. Then we heard them. Voices, low but clear, drifted through the air from above the trail. "They're here," someone said. "The four of them," another voice replied, the words sending a chill down my spine. My partner's grip tightened on my arm. They knew. They were looking for us specifically. We huddled together, barely breathing as the voices grew louder. Footsteps shuffled nearby, crunching leaves and snapping twigs. I dared a glance and saw movement through the trees. Just shadows, but close enough to make my pulse race. The voices continued, though they sounded more frustrated now. "Where did they go?" one of them asked, their tone sharp. For what felt like an eternity, we stayed frozen, waiting for the footsteps to fade. Finally, the sounds of the group began to move away, heading further down the main trail. "Now," I whispered, urging everyone to their feet. "We're going back the way we came. Stay close." We retraced our steps as quietly as we could, the dense foliage providing some cover as we moved. My partner carried the newborn, their face pale but focused, while I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone emerging from the trees. When we reached the main path, it was empty. The group had moved on, their presence lingering only in the eerie silence they'd left behind. We didn't waste time. We walked quickly, almost jogging, until the trailhead and the safety of our cars came into view. Sitting in the car, I could feel my heart finally start to slow, though my hands still trembled on the wheel. No one spoke as we drove back to my friend's dad's house. The kids, thankfully, seemed oblivious to the gravity of what had just happened, but the adults exchanged uneasy glances, each of us silently processing the encounter. We decided then and there never to return to that trail.